In our first lecture, we looked at the history of the Church's understanding of creation and how the Western and Eastern churches diverged on how they viewed the relationship between humanity, God, and creation. In this lecture, we will look at the current relationship and what might underlie a path towards a sustainable improvement, and also start to look at how the Church understands and is responding to the environmental crisis. In 1989, the ecumenical patriarch of the Orthodox Churches, Demetrios I, published his first encyclical letter on the environment, in which he declared that for the Orthodox, the 1st of September, the start of the Orthodox Church year, should be a day of prayer for creation, commemorating God's creation of the world. An encyclical letter has been published by the Patriarch each year since then. Demetrios' successor as Ecumenical Patriarch, Bartholomew I, has consistently proclaimed the primacy of spiritual values in determining environmental ethics, for which he was given the title Green Patriarch by the media in 1996, a title endorsed by the US Vice President Al Gore the following year. In 1998, the Anglican bishops who were gathered at Lambeth expressed their concern that efforts to address the issues raised by the fifth mark of mission, and for those of you that can't quite recall what that is, to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth, be given greater visibility and be better coordinated across the Anglican Communion. After some initial work, the Anglican Communion Environmental Network received recognition as an official network of the Anglican Communion at a meeting in Hong Kong in 2002, and has been working hard to bring environmental issues to the fore and provide material to assist in that. In 1999, the European Christian Environmental Network urged churches to adopt a time for creation stretching from the 1st of September to the Feast of St. Francis on the 4th of October. And this was endorsed by the European Ecumenical Assembly in Sibiu, Romania in 2007, which recommended that the period, quotes, be dedicated to prayer for the protection of creation and the promotion of sustainable lifestyles that reverse our contribution to climate change. The following year, the World Council of Churches invited churches to observe time for creation through prayer and action. From that time on, Christians worldwide have progressively embraced the season as part of their annual calendar. Since 2008, Churches Together in Britain and Ireland has compiled a programme of resources to encourage and assist churches to observe creation time, and in the years following, statements from religious leaders around the world have also encouraged the faithful to take time to care for creation during the month-long celebration. Pope Francis released his environmental encyclical Laudato Si on June the 18th, 2015, and at the same time made the Roman Catholic Church's adoption of the season of creation official. And in 2020 he said, "This is the season for letting our prayer be inspired anew by closeness to nature, to reflect on our lifestyles, for undertaking prophetic actions, directing the planet towards life, not death." And this season is now observed in most of the mainstream denominations worldwide, including provinces of the Anglican Communion, and forms a focus for Christian reflection on the environment and on environmental justice. Over the years, it has evolved to include justice for the poor as well as justice for the environment. And as Pope Francis points out in Laudato Si, there is a close relationship between these two cries of St. Francis. We have to realise that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment, so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, he wrote in his encyclical. And justice is a theme that we will return to later on. In summer 2021, just in time for COP26 in Glasgow, the Scottish Episcopal Church joined this movement in introducing liturgical material for this season. Since the early 1970s, there has been a productive dialogue between the Orthodox churches and the Anglican Communion in the Commission for Anglican Orthodox Theological Dialogue. The Buffalo Agreed Statement, the fourth such statement in the period since 1977, was published in 2015 and was called In the Image and Likeness of God, a Hope-Filled Anthropology. And in the section entitled Dominion, Stewardship and Priesthood, we find this rather helpful statement. In the Genesis account, the creation of humankind according to the image and likeness involves dominion. However, this dominion is not to be understood as arbitrary and tyrannical domination. It is precisely a dominion according to the image of God himself, who is loving and compassionate. Thus, the dominion with which we humans are entrusted signifies humility in self-giving service. We are called to heal, restore, and reconcile that which is fallen through our disobedience. We may be called stewards of creation, and this rightly emphasizes that the creation is not our private property, but belongs to God. At the same time, this stewardship is not to be interpreted as implying that the created order is merely an asset to be exploited, to be treated as an it rather than a thou. Human beings, therefore, have a responsibility to care for the whole created order and to foster ecological justice. The best description, however, is to say that we humans are priests of the creation. It is the essence of priesthood to offer, and so we fulfill our true vocation as persons created according to the divine image when exercising our royal priesthood. We offer the creation back to the Creator in joyful thanksgiving. Now, this is, of course, a very different understanding from that which Lynn White presented in his paper, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, that I spoke about last time, where he wrote, "Finally, God had created Adam and, as an afterthought, Eve, to keep man from being lonely. Man named all the animals, thus establishing his dominance over them. God planned all of this explicitly for man's benefit and rule. No item in the physical creation had any purpose save to serve man's purposes." On the 1st of September 2021, at the start of the season of creation and just before the COP26 climate summit, setting aside the theological and doctrinal differences of their churches, the leaders from the Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic and Anglican branches of Christianity came together for the first time in history to issue a joint statement to address the world's Christians with a single voice. Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew I, Pope Francis, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, called for the protection of creation, claiming that the current climate crisis speaks volumes about who we are and how we view and treat God's creation. And this is the first time that the three of us feel compelled to address together the urgency of environmental sustainability, its impact on persistent poverty, and the importance of global cooperation. Together, on behalf of our communities, we appeal to the heart and mind of every Christian, every believer, and every person of goodwill. We recall Scripture. Choose life so that you and your children may live. Deuteronomy 30, verse 19. Choosing life means making sacrifices and exercising self-restraint. So, for Christians, is the environmental crisis a crisis of science and technology, a crisis in public policy, or in behaviour, or is it something else, something perhaps deeper? For Patriarch Bartholomew, the environmental crisis is a matter of truthfulness to God, humanity, and the created order. He has spoken of environmental damage as being a contemporary heresy or natural terrorism. He therefore condemns it as nothing less than sin. In 1997, he declared that to commit a crime against the natural world is a sin. For human beings to cause species to become extinct and to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation, for human beings to degrade the integrity of the earth by causing changes in its climate, by stripping the earth of its natural forests, or by destroying its wetlands, for human beings to injure other human beings with disease by contaminating the earth's waters, its land, its air, and its life with poisonous substances, all of these are sins. The environmental crisis is, in reality, a series of interrelated, difficult, and complex problems that none of us has the answer to. It has been developing since at least the Industrial Revolution in the mid-18th century. Pope Francis writes in Laudato Si, there needs to be a distinctive way of looking at things, a way of thinking, policies, an educational program, a lifestyle, and a spirituality, which together generate resistance to the assault of the technocratic paradigm. Otherwise, even the best ecological initiatives can find themselves caught up in the same globalized logic. To seek only a technical remedy to each environmental problem which comes up is to separate what is in reality interconnected and to mask the true and deepest problems of the global system. So, perhaps we should ask ourselves, when faced with difficult and complex problems, what has been the approach of the people of God historically? Well, I would suggest that they have turned to God in prayer and lament. And in an age where much of the prevailing narrative is that humanity is able to overcome almost all problems by scientific endeavour or technological advance, it is countercultural to suggest that perhaps an important part of our response is to turn to God rather than engage in ceaseless activity. However, Christianity has never shied away from being countercultural, has it? After all, was Jesus, in everything he said and in everything he did, not the very essence of countercultural? We are often convinced that solving a particular problem, in this case the environmental crisis, is simply a matter of acting differently, more effectively, more sustainably, or taking action of some sort. But let us not forget that it is the actions of human beings that have led to the crisis in the first place. Paradoxically, providing the corrective to the environmental crisis may in fact begin with environmental inaction, with clear vision and with awareness. Many organisations, not least churches, seek to address one particular aspect of the environmental crisis, the climate change part, through lists of actions to be taken by the organisation as a whole or by its members individually. But as Hannah Malcolm, who I mentioned last week, argues, this may not be the appropriate starting point for a Christian response, suggesting that it is not only appropriate but essential that the people of God engage with their God in prayer and lament isn't to imply that action to tackle the environmental crisis isn't urgent. Far from it. It is far more urgent than the rather unambitious targets that governments and most organisations set for themselves, or that came out of COP26 in Glasgow in November 2021 or COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh a year later. Lament, as I'm sure you know, is the exercise of spiritual agency in the face of loss. As a spiritual practice, it helps us to incorporate the experience of loss into the broader story of our lives before God. Where grief threatens to close our hearts in despair, lament reopens our hearts to the possibility of a recovered sense of wholeness. Lament doesn't internalise our pain, sorrow or loss, but helps us to call out to God. So it's not just an expression of deep emotion resulting from loss. It calls to God for action and ends in praise of God. In the current crisis, much has been lost, is currently being lost, and will continue to be lost in the created world around us and in the lives of people all over the world. In many ways, that is what Malcolm's collection of essays, Words for a Dying World, is engaging with. I have a copy here. In short, it is a very different approach to thinking about what is often called climate change or global warming, both of which sound relatively benign, but more recently has been referred to as climate breakdown or ecological collapse, which quite rightly sound rather more dramatic and urgent. It is essentially a collection of individual stories written by people of faith from many parts of the world, coming from many different perspectives. It very much lives up to its subtitle, Stories of Grief and Courage from the Global Church. And the refreshing thing about it is that Malcolm and the other 35 contributors turn to the ancient practice of lament in their thinking and writing about their climate and ecological grief and sense of loss, referred to also as solastalgia. This also helps us to see that this is a global problem that affects individuals and communities in a whole range of different ways that the rest of us can only imagine. Climate change knows no territorial boundaries, nor does air pollution or what any one country dumps into the sea or into other waterways. David Osborne went to Orkney for an extended holiday and noticed even in that place, far from heavy industry and intensive agriculture, the plastic and nylon on the beaches, the lack of terns nesting, and he heard the fishermen refer to the decline of the fisheries in the islands. And this caused him to reflect on the environment and on other places where he had been. In particular, the deep well of reflections that he had accumulated from a walk that he made 20 years before from his home in Shropshire to the abbey on Iona. And as a result of those reflections, Osborne identifies 12 virtues: wonder, engagement, simplicity, community, compassion, justice, repentance, faith, fellowship, hope, wisdom, and love. These emerge from the engagement that he had with people and places as he was walking along between Shropshire and Iona. The good and the bad, the lovely and the unlovely, the joyful and the sad. His journey from Rockwoodine to Iona in many ways reflecting the journey we ourselves and our planet face as we face an uncertain future together. But we can journey together in hope so long as we do not revert to an unjustified self-reliance buoyed up by the hubris of human capability. Global warming and other forms of environmental degradation are not caused by using the wrong technology for energy generation. They are, to put it bluntly, caused by overconsumption, primarily in the developed world. This is an inconvenient truth that is frequently glossed over or ignored by politicians and commentators, largely because it would mean real change, rather than attempting to green up business as usual. The awkward reality is that there is no solution that is not underpinned by substantially reduced consumption in the developed world. Dealing with that on a large scale would demand difficult decisions that are likely to be deeply unpopular and within the sort of timescales that politicians work to, the next election, and would require great courage. It is far easier for leaders and decision makers in organisations, the church not being excluded from this, to set targets well beyond the timescale of political ambitions, time in office, or even lifetimes. That means that one will not have to deliver whilst in power or in charge, as the problem of delivery will be on someone else's watch. In its report, Planes, Homes and Automobiles, the role of behaviour change in delivering net zero in 2021, the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change concludes, behaviour change is unavoidably a much more important part of the response to climate change than has been the case to date. You don't say. A much greater proportion of changes in the next 15 years will be delivered by behaviour change than in the last 15 years. This cannot be avoided and must be part of any credible strategy. But we have a long way to go to prepare and engage the public in the kinds of behaviour change that will be required. Yes. Consumption is a behaviour for which we are all responsible. Everything we buy has an environmental impact. Everything we use has an environmental impact, and everything that we consume has an environmental impact. And that impact results from the sum of a number of links in a chain of activities. It starts with the extraction of raw materials used for the manufacture of goods and commodities, which are then transported to where they are purchased and used. A period of use follows, and finally there is the disposal of items when they are no longer required or broken beyond repair. It goes without saying that there is a cumulative effect as we move along the chain, and so action earlier in the chain has a rather greater effect on reducing that footprint than later. It follows also that a reduction in demand has a much greater impact than a reduction in use, and so any strategy should start there. Fortunately, reduction in demand for goods and commodities is something that we, as consumers, can each contribute to very effectively. We can also influence distance that goods are transported by our buying habits and ensure that items that are no longer of use to us can find a new home if they have not reached the end of their lives. Since the root of the problem is that the population of the developed world vastly overconsume the resources of the world, that means us. The only real solution is a reduction in consumption for each of us individually and for all of us collectively. How we do that depends very much on our circumstances as individuals, as communities and nations. This is very definitely a case where one size fits all doesn't apply. Whilst we all have choices, for some the scope of choice is wide, but for other individuals, communities or nations, with the resources available to them, it is a struggle simply to provide sufficient food, let alone having choices as consumers. And it's incumbent on those who have the resources to be able to afford to make choices as consumers, to exercise what discretion they have wisely, and for all of us to reduce our consumption. Now, I said earlier that I would return to justice, so let us return to justice. The wider problem is not simply about carbon budgets or even environmental degradation. The real problem is about justice. In his writings, the Ecumenical Patriarch has frequently pointed out the link between environmental destruction and poverty, showing that social justice and ecological justice are linked. He writes, "Concern then for ecological issues is directly related to concern for issues of social justice, and particularly of world hunger. A church that neglects to pray for the natural environment is a church that refuses to offer food and drink to a suffering humanity. At the same time, a society that ignores the mandate to care for all human beings is a society that mistreats the very creation of God, including the natural environment. It is," he says, "tantamount to blasphemy." Pope Francis, in Laudato Si', writes, "We are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. Those that are most affected by these matters are, of course, the poor, the disadvantaged, those who live in less developed parts of the world. We should, therefore, refer to this matter as environmental justice, which helps us to stop thinking primarily in scientific or technological terms and looking purely for scientific or technological fixes. We need to reflect on how our decisions affect others in our own society and our brothers and sisters around the world, and also how our decisions will affect our children and grandchildren. As David Rhodes says at the start of his book, Climate Crisis, The Challenge to the Church, the world is in serious trouble. The lives of millions of people are blighted by poverty, injustice and racism. But overshadowing all this, the emerging crisis of climate change is rapidly destroying God's creation and threatening our survival as a species. Our poorest neighbours are already suffering acutely, but it will be our children and their children who will bear the full impact of the disaster. And in the preface to her report on the injustice of climate change for Christian Aid, Paula Clifford begins, "The starting point of this report is the fact that climate change is above all a justice issue. The people who are already suffering most from global warming are those who have done the least to cause it and have the least resources to do anything about it." So the basic question underlying the theological statements made here is not why should Christians care about the environment? It is, why do Christians care about injustice? As the first stanza of a long poem written by an anonymous scribe, which was often quoted during the COVID-19 pandemic, says, "I heard that we were all in the same boat." But it's not like that. We're in the same storm, but not the same boat. And your ship can be shipwrecked, and mine might not be, or vice versa. The environmental crisis affects the whole planet, but it doesn't have the same effect on all. In his address to the Oxford Union in 2015, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew I said, once he'd got over why on earth they would want to invite him, "We know then that the ecological crisis is directly related to the ethical challenge of eliminating poverty and advocating human rights. The dignity and rights of human beings are intimately and integrally related to the beauty and, we would dare to say, the rights of the earth itself. After all, who will dare to speak for the voiceless resources of our planet? Who will step up to protect the silent diversity of its species? Will our generation accept responsibility for pushing our environment over the tipping point?" Drawing on the duty to care for the weakest members of society that is very evident in the Old Testament, that the ministry of Jesus sees the restoration of justice as an important facet of life in God's kingdom. The injustice inherent in the effects of pollution on climate is only one of a range of injustices that result from the overconsumption of the developed world, and in particular amongst the well-off in those societies. Over the last few decades, poor countries have been adversely affected by a variety of major world issues. In particular, the international debt crisis, unfair trade rules, unjust labour practices, pollution of the atmosphere and seas, natural disasters, infectious and respiratory diseases, and environmentally triggered health problems. On top of that, they are more susceptible to damage from climate change than their richer neighbours in the same regions, and have fewer resources to help them cope with and recover from its effects. It is unsurprising that the world is seeing increased numbers of economic migrants, which many Western nations are struggling to manage. We need to see the climate crisis as a people issue. The need to see the climate crisis as a people issue is emphasised by Christian Aid. Climate change makes a double demand on us. First, to recognise the link between human-induced global warming and poverty, and secondly, to formulate a just response. The first has been hindered for years by a reluctance to view climate change as a people issue rather than a purely environmental one, while the second raises ethical issues that have barely begun to be considered. During the United Nations General Assembly's high-level meeting on the protection of the global climate for present and future generations in March 2019, Mary Robinson, the former President of Ireland, spoke about climate justice. Climate justice insists on a shift from a discourse on greenhouse gases and melting ice caps into a civil rights movement with the people and communities most vulnerable to climate impacts at its heart. Now, thanks to the recent marches, strikes and protests by hundreds of thousands of school children, we have begun to understand the intergenerational injustice of climate change. And referring to the problem as environmental justice and not just climate change or global warming reframes the debate on such matters in the church and would allow the church to play to its strengths rather than trying to become a rather poor relation to organisations that specialise in environmental activism such as Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth or Extinction Rebellion. That doesn't, of course, mean that Christians shouldn't be involved in environmental activism, as they may feel called to join in the activities of these organisations independently of what they do in conjunction with other Christians as members of the body of Christ. Rowan Williams hinted at the distinctiveness of a Christian response when he commented, "The most immediate concern is very simple. Who's actually paying the price of our global crisis?" The answer is painfully clear. It is the poorest in the human family, those with least resource to meet the appalling demands that a warming world places on all of us. And this is where the question of justice most plainly arises, and where any Christian perspective will tell us that we cannot let this go unchallenged. As Christians, we believe that anyone's suffering or danger is everyone's challenge, and potentially everyone's loss. A changing climate, and indeed a wider spectrum of environmental problems, is a global justice issue, which knows no boundaries, and although it will ultimately affect us all, those who are already being affected are often the poorest in the world, those who actually contribute least to the problem. They are the ones who are losing their land to the sea, as global warming and melting ice caps result in sea level rise, whose crops are failing because of changes in rainfall patterns, and who are becoming more vulnerable to a whole range of diseases. As we've already seen, at the root of the environmental justice problem is overconsumption in the developed world. There is a radical inequality in how the Earth's resources are used and in the lifestyles that result. The developed world has a high rate of consumption and contribution to environmental problems, whilst the rest of the world faces the consequences. In their now classic work, The Spirit Level, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett draw on a wide range of sources and situations to explain why inequalities are ultimately not good for anyone. They point out that living standards cannot be improved forever, and that it is not wealth and possession that ultimately lead to people living satisfying and happy lives. Recently, we have seen that a global pandemic cannot be brought under control by vaccinating the people of one nation without also ensuring that the people of the rest of the world have adequate access to vaccines. Vaccine nationalism has little long-term effectiveness. Much of Jesus' teaching, and in particular his parables tell the same story. The good news of the Gospels is concerned with community, and that is underlined by the Golden Rule. Jesus brought new hope to the poor and marginalised, not only by what he said, but by what he did. It is that legacy to which Christians are heirs, and why Christians should discern the injustice that lies at the heart of our present climate crisis. So, over the years, Patriarch Bartholomew has frequently insisted that no real protection of the environment can be based on the same utilitarian logic that has led to its destruction. A new approach is needed, as science and technology alone cannot solve the environmental crisis that they created. And as long ago as 1989, Zizioulas suggested in a series of lectures at King's College London that ethics or rules are not the answer either. The solution lies at a deeper, more spiritual level. He writes, appealing, therefore, only to the ethical solution, as so many Christians seem to do today, would only reinforce the reasons that led to the ecological crisis in the first place. If we try to solve the ecological problem by introducing new ethical values or rearranging the scale of the traditional ones, I fear that we shall not go very far in reaching a solution. Part of getting on track to a more sustainable future is not simply getting public policies right, inventing new technologies and changing consumer behaviour, all of which are without doubt necessary, but must also entail changing how we value the natural world. For Christians, that has to include our understanding of what natural creation is, as well as what we can learn from studying the natural world itself. Zizioulas has insisted from his earliest writings on this subject, in language echoed elsewhere by others, including the Patriarch Bartholomew I, that addressing the environmental crisis has to be a matter of ethos rather than moral rules. He writes, there is a strong distinction between ethos and ethics, in that ethos is applied within a culture and presupposes community, whereas ethics operate on the basis of principles that are rooted in systems of thought. The ecological problem requires not just a prescribed code of behaviour, but a rediscovery of culture, an accepted way of being. And he also describes how the Orthodox tradition might contribute three elements of ethos. And he mentions a liturgical ethos, especially the Eucharistic ethos, referring creation back to God. The words that I quoted last week, thine own of thine own do we offer thee. Secondly, an iconographic ethos, showing that the presence of matter points beyond itself, and an ascetic ethos, in which fasting helps us to understand the limits of consumption. To these we will return in our final lecture. He suggests also that the approach that we take as Christians should be based on seeing how we treat the resources of the world as part of our relationship with God. And of course, central to that is how we worship. As Patriarch Bartholomew said in his address to the Oxford Union, Global warming is a moral crisis and a moral challenge. It's a crisis within the human heart. The solution of the ecological problem is not only a matter of science, technology and politics, but also primarily a matter of radical change of mind, of new values and of a new ethos. A radical change of mind. That sounds to me like nothing short of metanoia, or as it is often translated in modern Bibles, repentance. This radical change of mind suggests an opening of our understanding so that it may lead to transformation. Now, the 20th century has seen the most rapid technical development in human history. People born before powered flight have seen people walk on the moon. Over a period of only 5 decades, medicine has moved from leeches to organ transplants. In some parts of the world, we are seeing some of the most rapid population growth there has ever been, and we have seen some of the greatest wars in history. And sadly, there are several long-running bloody conflicts going on even as we speak. Whole nations have passed from a pre-literate tribal culture to modern statehood in a generation, often, I might say, to their detriment, and a loss of values that have allowed them to live a sustainable existence for many generations. There are great reserves of adaptability, not only in humanity, but also in the world's natural ecosystems, but there is increasingly evidence that at least in the latter there are limits. As the Man and Nature report that I mentioned last time said in 1974, what is the relation of man to his own nature and to external nature? Can the natural world and man's own nature stand the strains to which both are now being subjected? What are we doing to the world and to ourselves? If that was true in 1974, even though perhaps not widely understood, in 2023 it is even more true, and of course regularly the subject of discussion about the policies and plans to attempt to address it. In our third lecture, we look at the ways in which organisations around the world are addressing the environmental crisis and how well founded these approaches might be. And we will ask questions about the morality of what is going on in the name of fighting climate change and environmental destruction, as we ask the question, not zero? Thank you very much.